The 10th of November, 1918. Kaiser Wilhelm II boards a train destined for a foreign land, fleeing both the enemy and the wrath of his own people. The account of the once mighty German Empire was, for all practical purposes, closed. But how did it come to this point? I'm the Enlightened Edelweiss, and this is the sixth of a series of videos centered around the decline and fall of the German Empire. We last left off at the end of the year 1914. The First World War had begun and has since developed into a deadly stalemate, with neither side able to gain the upper hand. As the deadlock persisted, the German High Command sought to employ new, alternative methods of warfare, which were explored in the hopes that they would achieve what conventional methods could not. In January of 1915, the Kaiser permitted Zeppelin bombing raids to be carried out on Britain. In April, 160 tons of chlorine gas were unleashed on the French army, in what was to be the first ever instance of large-scale chemical warfare. In May, the German Navy initiated its campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare, which culminated in the sinking of the passenger ship the Lusitania. All this resulted in the further solidification and propagation of the popular image of Germans being nothing more than barbarous Huns who wished to decimate civilization. Apart from these experiments, however, the Germans remained largely cautious, preferring to sacrifice territorial gain for superior and more defendable positions. This meant that the Entente was always fighting an uphill battle, often quite literally. It's therefore no surprise that 1915 saw a number of failed offensives by the Entente, while the Germans maintained their highly defendable positions. Though while the West remained indecisive, the war in the East was far more mobile, with the launch of a massive German counteroffensive which pushed back the Russians considerably and resulted in the occupation of Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia by the Central Powers. This undoubtedly kept Hindenburg and Ludendorff's reputation sky high among ordinary Germans, especially considering the situation in the West. And speaking of ordinary Germans, the situation at home wasn't particularly pleasing, though the worst was yet to come. 1914 saw the beginning of the British naval blockade against Germany, and while the German economy was undoubtedly strong, it was far from self-sufficient, and this resulted in serious food shortages. Additionally, as the war dragged on, the military began to increasingly seep into the everyday running of the country. Article 68 of the Constitution allowed military leaders to seize executive control on a local level, giving them direct control over policing, education, resource allocation, and crucially, censorship. These extensive powers were used to serve a warped narrative of the war, not just to the ordinary people, but to the Kaiser and the rest of the government as well. This ensured that while technically the Kaiser had control over the military, the situation on the ground was quite the opposite. Meanwhile, while the Kaiser was increasingly being cast into the shadows, the victories in the East had catapulted Paul von Hindenburg into a position of fame and respect. His distinctive and imposing figure made him a suitable candidate to fill the void of leadership left by the Kaiser, and his legendary status was used as a ploy to override and encroach on legitimate and democratic processes. Soon, Hindenburg and Ludendorff at his side were the only ones really in control, and allegiance to the Kaiser and the Reichstag existed only in lip service. The so-called silent dictatorship had been established. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, content with its victories in the East, the German High Command decided to shift its main focus to the West, unleashing a thunderous offensive. The Allies, consisting of France, the UK, Russia, and their newest member, Italy, decided to conduct a number of coordinated offensives themselves, meant to overwhelm the enemy on various fronts. The result was the Battle of Verdun. While there is some debate around German Chief of the General Staff Erich von Falkenhayn's motives, some historians speculate that he aimed to conduct a campaign of controlled attrition meant to slowly bleed out French forces and force them to the negotiating table. However, regardless of what his plan really was, it's quite clear that it spiraled out of control quite quickly, as both sides poured in massive amounts of resources into a battle that simply seemed to drag on. The end result was a catastrophe for all of those involved. It's estimated that the Germans lost a total of 337,000 men, and while the French technically won the battle, having regained quite a bit of land, their losses exceeded that of the Germans, numbering around 377,000 men. Aiming to relieve some of the pressure faced by the French due to Verdun, the British planned an offensive of their own, attacking German positions near the river Somme. However, the Germans were well aware of the attack far before it came and made sure that they were fully prepared. When British artillery began to viciously pound the German lines, it didn't amount to much, as by then the Germans were very well fortified and dug in. The resulting battle, much like Verdun, was an absolute bloodbath, with the Allies losing around 615,000 men, and the Germans losing an estimated 600,000 men. The battle also saw the first ever use of tanks on the battlefield by the British, and while they were undoubtedly successful, in the end the battle remained inconclusive and the stalemate persisted. Both Verdun and the Somme left a crucial mark on the morale of not only the soldiers, but the ordinary civilians as well, and anti-war sentiment began to slowly creep into German society. However, this was far from the only reason that the German public began to steadily resent the war. As stated earlier, the British naval blockade had severely impacted the lives of German citizens, and by 1916, the situation was serious. Additionally, food shortages were intensified even further, with the government essentially operating a total war command economy, with all resources going toward the war effort, while the civilians began to starve. Workers rose up in mass strikes, occasionally even in munitions factories, and the Social Democrats began to call for an end to the war. Something had to be done, and so Hindenburg once again launched a ruthless campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare, in the hopes that it would break the British naval blockade. While the campaign undoubtedly caused much damage, it was ultimately disastrous, as it dragged the previously neutral United States into the war, just as victory in the East was imminent. The war was now in its last stages. The endgame had begun.